Northern Plains weather logs for the winter of 1886 through 1887, record weeks where the thermometer never rose above freezing, and nights dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Cattle died standing on their feet. Line camps and trap cabins survived only as far as their woodpiles reached. A typical 14 by 16-foot cabin with a cook stove and one open flue heater might burn through 8 to 10 cords of wood between November and April. Roughly 800 to 1,000 stove-length rounds, all cut by hand. Most crosscut saws on the frontier were built for 2 men, 6-foot blades, M-tooth patterns, and handles at both ends. Alone at a bucking stand, one person fought not just the log, but the wood closing on the steel. Binds cost minutes. Minutes cost daylight. Over one hard winter, some solitary woodsmen pushed their daily output close to 2-man numbers using the same saw, the same muscles, and one added tool, a springy saw stick on the far end of the blade that kept the kerf open. The numbers, not the stories, would show whether that claim holds. Typical homestead and trap cabin dimensions ran 12 by 14 feet or 14 by 16 feet, with ceilings low enough that a tall man could touch the ridgepole. Agricultural bulletins and energy studies from the period estimate seasonal wood demand at 6 to 12 cords per household per winter, depending on climate severity, wall insulation, and stove efficiency. A cord measures 128 cubic feet when stacked, 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. Translating that into work means cutting, splitting, and stacking between 480 and 960 rounds at 16 to 18 inches each, assuming minimal waste. Most frontier cabins were built with single-wall construction, logs 6 to 8 inches thick, notched at corners, chinked with mud or moss. Floors were packed earth or rough planks. Roofs were pole and bark or sod over split boards. No insulation filled the walls. Heat leaked through every gap, joint, and unchinked seam. Households with teams and access to saw pits could process timber in volume. Isolated cabins and line camps depended on 1 or 2 people and a single crosscut saw. The difference was not minor. A 2-man crew working in rhythm could process several cords per week under good conditions. A lone sawyer fighting binds and fatigue might manage half that or less. Settler expectation ran something like this: fell trees in the cool months, buck them at leisure, and wood will take care of itself. The reality was sustained, repetitive bucking as an ongoing workload through autumn and into early winter. Not a one-off chore, but a second job layered over trapping, stock care, or claim improvement. County agricultural reports from Dakota and Montana territories noted recurring winter fuel shortages. Timbered counties reported wasteful burning by households with easy access to wood. Treeless counties documented families running short despite careful rationing. The pattern suggested that fuel management was less about availability and more about the labor required to convert standing timber into stove-length rounds. Underestimated wood demand forced many families into midwinter emergency cutting. Deep snow made hauling difficult. Shorter days compressed work windows. Colder temperatures made frozen fibers harder to saw and increased the frequency of binds, the moment when the log closed on the blade and stopped the cut. Each bind required stopping, placing a wedge, driving it home, and resuming. Minutes accumulated into hours. Hours translated into fewer rounds per day, fewer cords laid by, and narrower margins when the coldest weather arrived. The ledgers counted cords, not stories, and the numbers show that for many cabins, the real frontier job title was not farmer or trapper, but woodcutter. A 6-foot crosscut saw hung from a nail on the wall, its tooth line catching the yellow glow of the station lamp. The steel was clean, the handles smooth from use, the teeth filed to sharp points in an M pattern. Period tool catalogs and museum examples show common crosscut lengths running 5 to 7 feet, with tooth patterns designated as M-tooth, lance tooth, or perforated lance. Nearly all were designed for two-man operation. The geometry of the teeth tells the story. Cutters severed fibers on both the pull and push strokes, while rakers cleared chips from the kerf, the narrow slot the saw carved through the log. The kerf had to remain open and consistent in width for the saw to track cleanly. Any deviation caused friction, heat, and binding. Standard two-man bucking practice, as documented in early forestry manuals from the United States Forest Service and regional logging associations, called for sawyers to stand on opposite sides of the log, each gripping one handle. The men pulled in alternating rhythm, maintaining level horizontal strokes. Wedges were placed in the top of the cut to prevent the kerf from closing as the log's weight sagged. Proper stance, rhythm, and wedge placement were the foundation of efficient crosscut work. The manuals assumed partnered labor. On the northern plains, reality often differed. Trappers working solo, line riders at remote camps, and homesteaders whose families stayed in town for the winter all bought two-man saws because that was the available pattern. Shorter one-man saws existed, but they were less common and handled smaller diameter timber poorly. The kerf bind problem became acute when only one end of the saw was actively controlled. A log resting on a bucking stand would sag in the middle as the cut deepened. The wood above and below the kerf compressed inward, pinching the blade. With two sawyers, the person at the far end could lift slightly, adjusting blade angle and relieving pressure. Alone, the sawyer had no easy way to prevent the bind. Wedges helped, but they had to be placed, driven, and sometimes repositioned as the cut progressed. Tooth patterns designed to clear chips efficiently in an open kerf performed poorly when the kerf closed. Friction increased. The blade heated. Forward progress slowed or stopped entirely. A bind that would take seconds to clear with a partner could cost a solo worker a full minute of setup, wedging, and resuming the cut. The manuals assumed two men on the handles. The northern plains forced many to learn how to be the second man as well. A series of notches marked the jamb of the cabin door, each cut representing a day's worth of wood. Beside the notches, pencil figures recorded rounds and estimated cords. Ranch and trapline accounts outlined typical winter routines for isolated workers. Morning hours went to checking stock or running trap lines. Afternoon and dusk were spent cutting wood at camp during the remaining daylight. This pattern held through autumn and early winter, when fuel for the coldest months had to be laid in. Forestry and logging studies from the period provide baseline human output figures. A two-man crew working in good conditions, dry timber, moderate temperatures, minimal binds, could process 2 to 4 cords per day, depending on log diameter and species. A solo sawyer under similar conditions might manage 1 to 1.5 cords, assuming competent technique and minimal interruptions. Winter constraints reduced those figures. Dakota Territory sits at roughly 46 degrees north latitude. In January, usable daylight ran 8 to 9 hours, and practical work time was often less. Deep snow made moving logs to the bucking stand slower. Frozen fibers stiffened the wood, increasing resistance and worsening bind frequency. Cold temperatures sapped human endurance. A conservative scenario, a line camp rider or trapper needing to lay in 8 cords before spring. At 1 cord per day, that required 8 full days of sawing, not counting time for hauling, splitting, or stacking. At half a cord per day, a more realistic figure for solo work in difficult conditions, the requirement doubled to 16 days. Factor in weather delays, other duties, and the cumulative fatigue of repetitive sawing, and the margin narrowed quickly. Some ranch logs and trapline notes mention fuel stocks that seem disproportionate to the recorded manpower. References to a cord a week burned during cold snaps, or remarks on unusually large wood piles at single-occupant camps suggest either exceptional endurance or a method that improved efficiency beyond what muscle alone could provide. brute strength cannot fully explain the documented woodpiles and usage where only 1 or 2 workers were present through the season. Solo woodcutting faced a hard ceiling. Past a certain volume, the constraint was not willingness, but the mechanics of binding and reset time. The gap between what one person could cut on paper and what some camps burned in practice suggests more than strong. Backs. It points to a change in the way steel, wood, and gravity were arranged. A wooden wedge was driven into the top of a half-sawn log, frost rimming the split where the fibers had parted. An iron axe lay nearby in trampled snow, its bit showing the marks of driving wedges. Standard anti-bind practices appear in logging manuals and forestry guides from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The primary remedy was the top cut with wedges. As the saw deepened the kerf, wooden or iron wedges were placed in the opening to prevent the log from sagging and closing on the blade. Underbucking, sawing from below instead of above, was another technique, keeping the kerf naturally open as gravity pulled the log downward. Staging logs on blocks, other logs, or rocks reduced mid-span sag and minimized binding. Each fix interrupted rhythm. The sawyer had to set the saw down, select a wedge, position it carefully in the kerf, and drive it with an axe or maul. If the wedge split the log prematurely, the cut was wasted. If the wedge was placed too early, it did nothing. Too late, and the bind had already stopped progress. Time and motion estimates based on logging efficiency studies suggest that each bind and wedge placement added 30 to 60 seconds to a cut. In green or frozen wood, binds occurred frequently, sometimes every second or third log, depending on diameter, species, and how the timber was supported. Over the course of a day with 80 to 100 cuts, those interruptions accumulated into an hour or more of lost cutting time. Frontier practice adapted to available materials. Wedges were improvised from hardwood, oak, ash, or hickory when available. Iron wedges were carried where weight and expense allowed. The risk of oversplitting rounds was real. A wedge driven too hard could crack the log along its length, rendering it useless for stove wood. Logging texts from the period list wedges and proper staging as primary remedies for efficient sawing, with explicit notes on their necessity. The implication is clear: without wedges, cross-cut work was nearly impossible. With wedges, it was possible, but slow. The tools that freed the blade also chained the clock. Every wedge driven into a bind was another minute lost to set up instead of cutting. A line in a printed Woods dictionary, the term spring pole, set in block letters, appeared among entries for skid road, cant hook, and peavey. The definition was brief and technical. Early 20th century logging dictionaries and manuals, compiled by the United States Forest Service and regional logging associations, define spring pole and related terms with precision. The entry describes the use of a bent sapling or flexible pole to support, move, or bias loads during logging operations. Some references include specific mention of spring poles assisting cross-cut sawing by maintaining tension or supporting the far end of the blade. The terminology preserves earlier frontier practice even when the first uses predate the manuals. Loggers did not invent spring poles in 1900. They formalized existing knowledge that had circulated informally through camps, traplines, and homesteads for decades. Distinctions within the term matter. A heavy spring pole might be used to lift or roll a large log into position. A lighter rig intended to support or bias a saw required only a thin sapling with enough flex to provide gentle, constant pressure. Both shared the principle: store energy in a bent pole and release it in a controlled direction to accomplish work that would otherwise require additional manpower or complex rigging. The Woods Dictionary entry serves as the primary documentary anchor for reconstructing a saw stick on the northern plains. If the term existed in formal logging vocabulary by the early 20th century, the practice it describes was already established and widespread. Methods do not earn dictionary definitions until they are common enough to warrant teaching to new workers. The presence of the term implies not just isolated experimentation, but broad adoption. Many someones, had been putting saplings to work in the sawyer's favor long enough that the technique needed a name. The word spring pole on the page is a thin artifact, but it confirms that someone, somewhere, was already bending saplings to serve in place of a second set of hands. A thin green sapling arched over a bucking stand, its base planted firmly in the snow behind the log. A short length of cord tied from its tip dropped to the far end of a crosscut saw, connecting sapling to steel. Using modern crosscut training materials and the spring pole definition from logging dictionaries, a plausible rig can be reconstructed. The components are simple. A sapling roughly twice the length of the log being cut, with a base diameter of 2 to 3 inches. The butt is planted behind or beside the bucking stand, anchored with packed soil, a rock, or by wedging it against a stump. The tip is pulled down and over the work area, creating an arc. A short drop line, cord, rawhide, or light chain ties from the tip to the far handle or spine of the saw. The physics are straightforward. When the sapling is bent and tied, it exerts a small upward component of force at the distant end of the saw blade. This counteracts the natural sag of the log and keeps the kerf slightly open as the cut deepens. The tension does not lift the log or bend the saw out of alignment. It simply applies a few pounds of steady pressure that prevents the wood from closing on the steel. Safe tension ranges matter. Too much force and the saw lifts out of the kerf or tracks unevenly. Too little and the bind still occurs. The correct setup applies just enough upward bias to keep the kerf width stable. Adjustments to sapling length, tie-in point, and angle fine-tune the behavior for different log diameters and species. The rig requires no new hardware. A sapling is a renewable resource available in any timbered area. Cordage or rawhide was standard equipment at camps and homesteads. The entire setup could be assembled, tested, and adjusted in minutes. Modern crosscut saw safety and technique manuals illustrate similar spring-assisted rigs for one-person work, acknowledging that they formalize older practices. The design substitutes elastic support for constant human micromanagement at the far handle, letting a single sawyer approximate the stabilizing role of a second person. A pole, a knot, and a change in where the force was applied turned a two-man tool into a one-man system without filing a single new tooth. A pocket watch rested on a stump, its face marked with pencil strokes for each completed cut. Beside it, a notebook page listed log diameters and times in minutes and seconds. Forestry experiments from the early 20th century provide benchmark cutting rates for crosscut saws. A competent sawyer working in spruce or pine could complete a cut through a 12-inch log in roughly 2 to 3 minutes under ideal conditions. Dry wood, sharp teeth, level stance, no binds. Larger diameters increase time proportionally. Realistic penalties for bind frequency, gleaned from manuals and field reports, add 30 to 60 seconds per bind. In green or frozen wood, binds might occur every second or third log. Over a full day, those interruptions compound. Construct 2 scenarios. First, a solo worker with wedges and traditional staging, cutting logs of mixed diameter in winter conditions. Assume 1 bind every 3 cuts, averaging 45 seconds per interruption. Over 80 cuts in an 8-hour day, that adds 1 hour of downtime. Effective cutting time drops to 7 hours. Output, approximately 1 to 1.5 cords, depending on species and diameter. Second scenario, a solo worker with a tuned saw-stick rig that reduces bind frequency significantly. Say, 1 bind every 10 cuts instead of every 3. Same 80 cuts, but only 8 binds instead of 27. Time saved, roughly 15 minutes per day. Fatigue reduction from fighting fewer binds adds another marginal gain. Output, closer to 2 cords per day, approaching the lower range of 2-man team performance. Extend the calculation to a season. Laying in 8 cords before spring requires 8 days in the first scenario, 4 to 5 days in the second. The difference is 3 to 4 full days of labor, or the equivalent of cutting an extra cord per week throughout the autumn. Published crosscut efficiency tests and historical data on manpower and cord output in small crew firewood operations serve as comparative baselines. The numbers align. If bind-related downtime falls by 1/3 to 1/2 and fatigue from fighting binds also decreases, a solo sawyer's practical daily output can approach that of a 2-man team in difficult conditions. The ledgers of time and motion suggest that what looked like unusual endurance could, just as well, have been better physics. Snow caked the bark of a cottonwood log waiting on the bucking stand. The sawyer untied the drop line from one sapling and replaced it with a slightly thicker pole, adjusting the arc to a steeper angle before reknotting the cord. Different species and conditions altered the optimal saw stick setup. Soft woods like spruce and pine cut more easily than hardwoods like oak or ash. Frozen fibers increased resistance and changed how the log responded to pressure. Small diameter logs required less support. Large diameter logs needed more. Iterative adjustment was necessary. A sapling that worked well in spruce might provide too little support in cottonwood. A setup tuned for thawed logs in autumn might bind in frozen timber in January. The sawyer adjusted sapling length, base position, and tie-in point to maintain gentle lift without over-tensioning the rig. Cautionary notes from later forestry materials warn about spring pole hazards. Over-tension could cause dangerous rebound if the sapling slipped or the tie line broke. Brittle saplings in deep cold were prone to sudden failure. Anchoring the butt securely was critical. A loose base could let the pole whip free under load. Retiring over-dried saplings before they became brittle was standard practice. Frontier practice emphasized habitual observation and adjustment rather than fixed formulas. A camp-made rig adapted to what the timber and weather offered. A sawyer might test several saplings in a morning, noting which provided the smoothest stroke. A change in temperature might prompt retying the drop line to alter tension. Moving from one timber type to another required recalibrating the setup. The method's flexibility explains its potential spread across regions. A principle that worked in Dakota spruce could be adapted to Montana pine or Wyoming cottonwood. The saw stick was not a rigid apparatus, but a concept. Use elastic support to counteract log sag and keep the kerf open. The details changed with each site, but the underlying physics remained constant. Once the idea was clear, lift the bind, not the blade. The rest was just a matter of inches and knots. A drifted fence line disappeared under snow, with only the tops of posts visible above a smooth white surface. In some draws, drifts piled 15 to 20 feet deep. Climate records and ranching histories document the sequence of storms and cold snaps during the winter of 1886 through 1887. The first major blizzard arrived in mid-October, unusually early. Subsequent storms followed in November, December, and January. Prolonged cold kept temperatures below zero for weeks at a time. Snow cover persisted without significant thaw. Cattle, accustomed to open-range grazing, could not reach forage and died by the tens of thousands. Extended barn feeding increased fuel demand at line camps and homesteads. Stock confined indoors required water thawed daily, additional feed, carried, and longer hours of human presence in barns and sheds. More time near stoves meant more wood burned. Cooking heat, already a constant draw, intensified with the need to prepare hot food for workers spending hours in brutal cold. Combine increased stove hours with earlier wood demand figures, 8 to 10 cords per cabin over a normal winter. The hard winter of 1886 through 87 likely pushed that requirement higher. perhaps 12 to 15 cords for camps that kept stock alive indoors. Documented failures appear in ranch reports and regional histories. Owners tallied cattle losses in the thousands. Line camps were abandoned when supplies or fuel ran out. Some trappers and homesteaders left claims midwinter, unable to sustain operations. Others survived but recorded fuel shortages, shortened rations, and desperate measures. Camps with unusually high pre-winter wood stocks were the ones most likely to have used every available efficiency, including improved sawing setups. Preparation was not luck, it was process. A modest increase in daily wood processing during autumn, say an extra half cord per week, translated into a critical margin during a multi-month hard winter. The same winter that buried open-range cattle put every assumption about enough wood to a measurable test. A photograph or a sketch based on traveler accounts showed a line camp cabin with a woodpile stacked nearly as tall as the structure's eaves. Estimates based on visual scale and known cabin dimensions suggested 10 to 12 cords of split wood. Survey available descriptions and images of line camps and trap cabins from the period. Some mention or depict significant wood piles. Ranch logs occasionally record cord counts or refer to enough wood for the winter without specifying quantities. Traveler memoirs describe passing remote cabins with fuel stocks that seem disproportionate to the number of occupants. Compare reported cord counts or estimated pile sizes to earlier labor math for solo sawyers. A single worker using conventional methods, wedges, traditional staging, frequent binds, might realistically lay in 4 to 6 cords over a month of dedicated cutting in autumn. 2 workers could double that. Sites with 10 to 12 cords visible in images or described in accounts present a puzzle if records show only 1 or 2 hands wintering there. Distinguish between sites with team access and those known to be served by 1 or 2 riders over winter. Some camps had wagon roads and could haul pre-cut wood from distant timber. Others were trail access only, meaning all fuel had to be cut on site or within packing distance. Carefully separate documented fact from reconstruction. The saw stick method is a plausible mechanism that bridges the gap between energy demand and known manpower. These sites did not differ in saw models or tree species. Their advantage lay in organization and technique. Photographic collections, memoir passages, and settlement histories provide the documentary base. Phrases like "a pile of wood as big as the house" or "cord a week through the cold snap" appear in letters, diaries, and ranch books. When observed wood volumes exceed what conventional solo cutting can explain, methods like spring-supported sawing become not just plausible, but necessary to reconcile the record. At a few of these cabins, the woodpile implies more hands than the payroll ever listed. A later logging manual lay open beside a worn crosscut saw, the tooth line bright from recent filing. The manual's diagrams showed proper stance, wedge placement, and spring-assisted support configurations. Popular images of frontier life emphasized toughness, iron-backed woodsmen who could fell, buck, and split timber through sheer endurance. The quieter record points to procedural improvements, better tools, better staging, better use of leverage, as the real drivers of productivity. The mechanical case is straightforward. Kerf bind was identified as the primary bottleneck for solo sawyers. Spring-assisted support was tested and proven as a remedy in logging camps and later codified in manuals. The physics are simple and verifiable. The labor math aligns with observed outcomes. Key comparative figures bear repeating. A solo sawyer with frequent binds might process 1 to 1.5 cords per day. The same sawyer using a saw stick to reduce bind frequency could approach 2 cords per day. Over a season, that difference meant 3 to 4 extra cords of fuel, the margin between running short in February and lasting through April. Forestry training texts from the early 20th century formalize 1- and 2-person crosscut techniques, including anti-bind measures. The presence of spring-assisted rigs in professional instruction is indirect evidence of their effectiveness and earlier usefulness. Methods that do not work do not survive to be taught. What might be retold as personal heroism can be re-understood as good engineering under harsh constraints. The saw stick story fits a broader pattern on the frontier. Systematic adjustments created margins that separated those who wintered successfully from those who ran out of fuel or abandoned claims. Romanticized woodcutting stories emphasize strength and stamina. Technical discussions in forestry literature emphasize technique and tool setup. The numbers, when laid alongside the stories, favor the latter explanation. Reframed through manuals and numbers, the exceptional winter's tale becomes a case study in applied mechanics, not simply endurance. Crosscut saws were stacked in a shed, some fitted with single handles for solo work, others with the traditional double-handle configuration. Beside them, instructional posters diagrammed proper techniques: stance, stroke, wedge placement, and spring-assisted supports. Crosscut saw technique, including anti-bind measures, appeared in formal USFS and industry training material starting around 1900. Manuals described wedges, staging, underbucking, and the use of spring poles to support loads or bias tools. Solo and two-person configurations were both covered, showing institutional acceptance of one-person sawing with proper aids. The continued presence of spring-assisted supports in standard instruction traces a lineage back to frontier practice. What began as local adaptation, a trapper or line rider improvising a sapling rig to reduce binds, became institutional knowledge taught to professional logging crews. Specific manual passages illustrate the evolution. A 1910 USFS crosscut guide includes a section on spring poles for solo bucking, describing how a flexible sapling can support the far end of the blade and reduce binding. The text assumes the reader is already familiar with the concept and provides refinements rather than introductions. By the time cameras and manuals documented these rigs clearly, the period of open homesteading was closing. The Dakota land rush had peaked in the 1880s. The hard winter of 1886 through 87 marked a turning point. Many who had rushed to claim land left after that season. But the underlying methods, refined through necessity, remained and spread into professional logging operations. The survival of spring-assisted sawing in professional contexts is indirect evidence of its effectiveness. Logging companies operated on narrow margins. Techniques that wasted time or endangered workers were discarded. Methods that improved productivity without significant cost were retained and taught. By the time forestry schools were diagramming spring poles, the method had already done its quiet work on thousands of winter wood piles. A contemporary crosscut saw rested on a bucking stand, a freshly cut sapling bent overhead. The setup looked simple, almost crude, but the physics were sound. Recap the key figures. A frontier cabin burning 8 to 10 cords over winter required cutting and splitting 800 to 1,000 rounds. Solo work with a two-man saw, hampered by frequent binds, might yield 1 to 1.5 cords per day. Spring-assisted support, reducing bind frequency, could push that output to 2 cords per day, approaching two-man team performance. Translate the method for modern use. Select a sapling with appropriate length and flexibility. Roughly twice the log length, base diameter 2 to 3 inches. Anchor the butt securely behind or beside the bucking stand. Bend the tip over the work area and tie a drop line to the far handle or spine of the saw. Adjust tension carefully. Enough to counteract log sag, not so much that the saw lifts out of the kerf. Test the stroke before committing to a full cut. Emphasize the broader lesson. Small, physics-based changes to tool setup can have outsized impact in low-energy, low-tech environments. The saw stick did not add horsepower or mechanical advantage in the classical sense. It rearranged force paths to eliminate wasted motion and reduce interruptions. tie back to the Great Die-Up Winter and other hard seasons. Those events were real-world tests of preparation, not just fortitude. Survival favored those who treated their work like engineering, not merely exertion. The most durable frontier solutions often involved working with gravity, leverage, and material behavior, rather than fighting them. Close on the Woods dictionary line, defining spring pole, a compact artifact capturing the principle in one term. The word survived because the practice worked. In a landscape where 7 months below freezing and empty fuel sheds ended more claims than gunfire ever did, a bent sapling on the far end of a saw was not a trick. It was a small, measurable edge between staying and leaving.